Hello, everyone. Today we have a special guest. His name is Lance Bush. And Lance, do you want to introduce yourself and your channel?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Lance Bush. I have a YouTube channel called Lance Independent. I also have a blog called Lance Independent. I write about mostly metaethics and in particular moral realism, but sometimes I touch on other topics like consciousness, free will, experimental philosophy, peer review, and a few other things on occasion. But yeah, I'm over there in both those places, YouTube and Substack. I like to argue about moral realism and anti-realism a lot, and that tends to be what I'm known for. If anyone knows anything about me, so yeah, that's what I do online, I guess.
Yeah. So, as far as I know, you are a moral anti-realist, right?
That's correct.
So maybe we can start by just telling us what is the best argument, or is there any particular argument for moral anti-realism that you have, or is it just the lack of good arguments for moral realism? I don't know. How do you see this?
Yeah. So, typically in philosophy, people, like at least in analytic philosophy, will wield certain arguments. Like for God, they'll wield like the Kalam cosmological argument or the ontological argument. People have these sort of like these packaged arguments that they present, and they'll often favor those arguments, and they will take a position to be the strongest position because on balance, those sort of prepackaged arguments that they favor, they think are overall stronger than whatever set of arguments there are to the contrary. It's not really the approach I tend to take. Some people might find that frustrating. Too bad. But I'm very much into a holistic, sort of more foundational approach towards the way that we go about assessing the merits of positions in philosophy. And so I don't come to the table with like, here's the argument that I have for this particular position. If someone pressed me and said, look, you got to have an argument, I do, which would be an abductive argument, which is that the best explanation for, and then I would insert like the way that people speak or think about morality, the disposition some people have to endorse moral realism, whatever the claim might be that could be leveraged for against realism. In those cases, I think that an anti-realist account, or at least not a realist account, does a better job of explaining the observations or the data or the considerations on the table. And so what I think is that all things considered, there's a better case for anti-realism than there is for realism. But the issue is when you say all things considered, I really do mean all things considered. And so you have to go all the way back towards like, well, what's the best meta-philosophical approach? Like, how should we even approach philosophy? What sorts of information should we use? What sort of method should we use? And I think that's where the real battleground is. And so I think if you have that sort of more fundamental dispute, and it turns out that the meta-philosophical and foundational approaches that I favor, which would be a very strongly empiricist and pragmatist approach, if you adopt that approach, and if you incorporate a modern understanding of psychology and language and evolution and that sort of thing, the anti-realist position just sort of falls out of that naturally. So for me, I live in an anti-realist framework pretty organically and without it really seeming like I need this particular argument that exists at the extremity of a whole bunch of things. Rather, it is the extension of those more foundational considerations, which are what I really care about. And then I see all these issues like anti-realism as sort of peripheral to those. So yeah, it would be an abductive argument. So the typical approach I take dialectically, like if I'm arguing with people, is two-pronged. Is a part of it is what you already suggested. One is I try to diffuse all of the arguments for moral realism. I try to argue these aren't great arguments. They're not particularly compelling arguments, and here's why. And then I say, okay, well, one thing is if you don't have any particularly good arguments for moral realism, that doesn't mean you have a lot of great arguments for moral anti-realism. That's when I step in with saying, okay, but if you look at the world from this holistic, more foundational perspective, and you look at the reasons why I hold those views, anti-realism is just a sort of natural extension or outgrowth of that.
I see. So maybe we could talk a little bit. What is the strongest or maybe the most popular argument for moral realism in your experience?
The strongest arguments for moral realism, or the most popular, I mean, those might be different questions.
Okay.
One of the most popular is going to be some type of Morean shift or some type of appeal to intuitions. So that's a very common argument that people will make, in particular for non-naturalist forms of moral realism. For naturalist accounts, it's going to be a bit harder. It's going to depend on whether they're like synthetic or analytic. I don't think the analytic ones are too popular, and so the synthetic ones are going to start offering these typically what's going to look also like a kind of abductive case where, hey, the best way to capture what we're saying and doing when we engage in moral practice fits with these certain sorts of natural facts that we could identify. So if you look at something like Sterelny and Fraser have quite a nice paper on this, where they talk about some of the behavioral characteristics. I think maybe my memory on this is rusty. That cooperation is a big part of it. But if there are natural facts about certain types of like facts about what would be conducive to coordinating actions among humans or devising appropriate norms for getting along with one another, that sort of thing, that account, those natural facts would be the moral facts, or the moral facts would supervene on some set of natural facts. And then what they would have to do is like look at how morality, like they would have to look at a bunch of empirical considerations, which is what they do. And so it's really going to depend on whether it's a naturalist account or a non-naturalist account. There are a host of other sorts of considerations, though. A popular approach, oh, sorry, I shouldn't say a popular approach. An approach I see a lot online, because I watch a lot of videos for Mike Humor, is a kind of process of elimination approach. And so that would roughly work like this. So you have the realist accounts and the anti-realist accounts. And if you could show that each one of the anti-realist accounts in turn is defective or unsatisfactory, if it's like it's something you want to reject, if you reject all the main positions, that pushes you towards, okay, realism seems to be the only option or the most appealing option. So humor employs that approach quite a bit. Other popular approaches are companions in guilt approaches. Those rose to prominence more recently with the work of Terence Cuneo and some others. And the way that those work is they basically say, look, and they're more of a reaction to anti-realist arguments, so more so than like a sort of positive argument. They're kind of a push towards, look, if you're going to reject moral realism, then similar considerations would compel you to also reject normative realism in other non-moral domains that you may not want to reject it in, such as, and probably the most easiest one to defend, is epistemic norms. So if you reject moral realism, you'd have to reject epistemic normative realism. You don't want to do that, so you don't want to reject moral realism. And so they're really a push towards, if a person has these other commitments, if you can expose a parity between morality and those other norms they want to hold on to, they have to make a choice. Are they going to reject those other norms and be a global normative anti-realist, or are they going to be, are they going to say, all right, I guess I'll accept moral realism too? So that's a popular argument. There's other ones that are not quite as popular. I feel like I'm saying a lot of stuff though. So there's Enoch's deliberative indispensability. Humor has an ontological argument for moral realism. I mean, I think maybe ontological is a bit tongue in cheek there, but I mean, it uses some features, but it's not, it doesn't really look like the theistic arguments. So that, those are a couple that are out there. There's more.
I see. So, for example, how would you respond to the argument from intuition? Because that's a popular argument. I have heard that one.
Right. And it's tough to argue against that in any sort of easy way. So if someone puts it in syllogistic form and they say something like, if it seems like moral realism is true, then you're justified in believing moral realism is true in the absence of defeaters. It seems like moral realism is true, so you're justified in believing in moral realism in the absence of defeaters. That's a very Humerian approach to it, which frames it in terms of both moral intuitions and phenomenal conservatism. My problem there would be the second premise, which is it doesn't seem to me that moral realism is true. Maybe I'd have an issue with phenomenal conservatism too, but before we even get there, I don't have realist intuitions. It's, a lot of moral anti-realists, especially analytic anti-realists, may say things like, look, I have realist intuitions, but I think, on net that the defeaters against moral realism outweigh those intuitions. But I don't have those intuitions in the first place. So any sort of argument that's supposed to appeal to the intuitions is not going to work directly on me if I don't have those intuitions. And so they would need to furnish me with something else, because what that gives them at that point is at best a kind of private justification. So if it seems to Humor that moral realism is true, Humor is justified in believing moral realism is true. But that's an argument for justification. It's not an argument that has the force of it's not public evidence. So that's sort of a shortcoming of any sort of direct appeal to intuitions. Other arguments are not going to have that sort of problem. So, Humor, also one I didn't mention, presents an argument from moral convergence. And so that is actually more up my alley. I reject it, but I think that it's a more serious argument to engage with from my point of view, because what he argues is he's like, look, over time, people have converged on having similar moral values. What's the best explanation for that? And one explanation is that people are accessing and acquiring knowledge of the objective or stance independent moral truths. So that's at least on the table for me as a possible explanation. And then I would have to argue that explanation is not as good as some other explanation. So that's like something that you could sort of sink your teeth into. But on the intuition front, the moment I say, okay, well, I don't have those intuitions, now we have to pivot to a discussion about, okay, well, even if I don't have the intuitions, ethical intuitionists like Humer and others may argue, okay, but we do. Our intuitions are reliable and they are furnishing us with justification and perhaps even knowledge of these stance independent moral truths. And then they would be able to offer some sort of account of what's going on with me, that I'm caught in the grip of a theory. That's something that they like to, like, basically I'm biased, or I'm because of certain theoretical commitments, I have lost access to these intuitions, or maybe I'm conceptually defective in some way and I don't have the intuitions. There would be some sort of account on their end for why I don't have them. So then we have to start getting into the nitty gritty questions about like human psychology. And okay, so what are intuitions exactly? How are they supposed to work? I hold a somewhat unusual position. So at least some philosophers are skeptical that intuitions are used frequently as evidence in philosophy. Now, it looks like to me like people like Humer do clearly use them as evidence, but Herman Kaplan and others have argued that intuitions play little, if any, evidential role in philosophy. I hold an even more skeptical position, which is that I favor basically the view that intuition, as it's used in philosophy, is a defective concept. I don't think it picks out any particular kind of mental state. And so the blunt way, like if rip off the Band-Aid, is I don't really think intuitions are a thing. I don't think people actually have intuitions. So I would be responding to ethical intuitionists in a possibly what might look a much more aggressive way, which is, I'm not saying, look, your intuitions in this case aren't reliable. I'm saying I don't even think you have intuitions. I don't think that's a real psychological kind. And that is a very drawn out discussion if we wanted to go that route.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So maybe, I'm actually kind of on the fence about it, about moral realism. So I kind of tend to think that morality is objective, but I do agree. I understand that I have a hard time actually proving it. And so when I think about it, okay, why is it so hard to prove? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it is subjective. And sometimes when I take to think about it, like when you go to the details, to the real, the granular parts of morality, maybe it does boil down to a subjective opinion at some point. I'm not sure. Maybe you can convince me that I'm wrong. So maybe I can give you my definition of my account of morality. And it looks, I would say, let's put it in this way. Something is morally wrong, it's immoral. An action is morally wrong if it hurts somebody else, an agent, for no good reason. And what I define as a good reason, what counts as good reason, that would be is something like protecting your life, protecting your property, or protecting your well-being. Protecting so your property and your well-being, they are kind of the same thing in a way. So that's for me, the virtue of my definition. I think when people say morality, this is morally wrong, they mean like in this sense. They mean, okay, this is hurting somebody else for no good reason, right? I think that's kind of how I will define it. Now, what do I think? Maybe you can give me your opinion about it. What do I think is the difficulty in my view? Is how do you know what is a good reason? Like exactly, maybe in determining if the reason is good or not, there's going to be some subjectivity. Like ultimately, I think maybe that's a difficulty when I think about it. But what do you think of my definition of my account?
Yeah, so there would be a number of questions I would have with exploring this definition. One issue is the question of what we take ourselves to be doing when we offer a definition, like, that morality is about causing harm for no good reason. We could be describing what we take people to mean when they make moral claims or they engage in moral discourse in everyday practice. we could be offering a sort of stipulative definition and then seeing where that goes. You could say, look, I'm not saying this is what other people mean. I'm saying here is how I'm going to use the term, and then we explore where that takes us, and maybe that takes you somewhere philosophically defensible or interesting. Or you could argue perhaps for some sort of semantic thesis that isn't really bound up necessarily with like empirical questions about ordinary practice. It may in some way be directly or indirectly related to those practices, but a lot of times when philosophers do something approximating conceptual analysis, they're not like conducting empirical studies. They're not running out around surveying people, and yet they still take themselves to be capturing what words and phrases and positions mean, and take themselves to be sort of uncovering the contours of the concepts that they take to be operative, and to pick out, real phenomena. And so there's a number of things that you could take yourself to be doing, and I'm not sure which one of those things you take yourself to be doing.
I think is number one. I think the word encapsulates what normal people have, like in their minds, even if they have it in an unconscious way. I think that's what normal people mean when they say, okay, this act is immoral. What they mean is this is evil. This is hurting somebody else for no good reason, just for the sake of it, and that's wrong. I think that's kind of what they mean.
Yeah. So do you take that to be an empirical claim about people's psychology?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Are you familiar with the psychologist Kurt Gray?
No.
Yeah. So it's interesting because Kurt Gray, and I think Sheen, and there's some other people that have worked with him on these projects. He argues that from a psychological perspective, it actually is the case, appearances notwithstanding, that moral judgment is roughly reducible to judgments about harm. Like he thinks it's all reducible to harm. So you might want to have a look at his research if you haven't seen it, because what he tries to do is he takes himself. So he's a psychologist. He's not doing philosophy. He's doing psychology. But he takes himself to be dealing with the primary contenders for what you might call pluralist views about what morality is about. So the main pushback you would get, and I would probably favor a very open-ended pluralist perspective, perhaps even more than some of the ones I'm about to describe. So, I wouldn't accept your position on empirical grounds, but I wouldn't count it out. I don't think that we have anywhere near a settled moral psychology. So, although I'm not persuaded by Kurt Gray's account, this is the very early days of moral cognition research. So, we'll see where things go. I would bet against your position, but it's on the table. So the primary contender would be something like Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, which holds that there's 5, now maybe 6 foundations, maybe 7. They added, is it 6? They expanded the list pretty recently. And I know they split up one of them into 2. And then there's always the question of whether you add liberty. Anyway, so their approach is, what they say is, okay, look, we don't have one thing that we moralize, just harm. We actually moralize as sort of autonomously and independently moral in their own right, a host of other considerations. So the original 5 would be harm and fairness, in addition to respect, loyalty, and purity. And there's a few other ways that they describe those terms. But what Haidt thinks is that we moralize these things like purity violations and respect violations as moral or immoral, independent of whatever harm they may cause, at least to some extent. And he presents empirical research which purports to show that this is the case, and then Gray attempts to show that it's not really the case, and it's a whole thing right now. So I don't consider the matter settled. So from an empirical perspective, you could be right, but why don't I think that? Well, one reason I don't think that is that if you talk to philosophers, like if you look at, for instance, the Phil Paper survey results, what you'll get is about a 3-way split between the 3 main normative camps. It's one of the rare cases where it's almost exactly a tie, which is virtue ethics, deontology, and consequentialism. And I would imagine that virtually anybody that would adopt your perspective would fall into that consequentialist camp, but they only make up about a third of philosophers. And these are people that have reflected and thought a lot about what their values are. And most of them, at least, don't seem to reduce their moral considerations exclusively to harm considerations. And that would include even consequentialists, because deontologists say, no, actions aren't right or wrong in virtue of the consequences, such as the harm they bring about. They're right or wrong in virtue of, like, they basically take the action type itself as the locus of moral concern. Stealing, lying, like, before we even look at the consequences, put a blinder on. Is the action a type of stealing? Then it is wrong. So deontologists take an approach more like that. Virtue ethicists is a little more complicated, but roughly they think that you internalize and cultivate certain virtues, and then virtuous action is something that flows sort of naturally out of a person that's cultivated the relevant sorts of virtues. And so they focus more on character traits than actions. But again, they're not going to be exclusively focused on harm. And then if you take that last group, the consequentialists, they care about consequences. They don't all care only about harm. So among philosophers, it would be a small minority that would hold that view. But I don't put that much stock in what philosophers think. Maybe the ones that are focused on harm are right. So that's at least one consideration. So there's two. There's empirical research which suggests that people may moralize things other than harm. And two, a lot of philosophers that have thought a whole lot about this sort of topic don't reduce all of their concerns to harm.
Yeah. Okay. I will be, without arguing about this too much, I will be a bit skeptical about whether those people who moralize things other than harm, where I think harm was really included there is somehow. For example, you mentioned respect. I think you harm a little bit somebody when you disrespect them, like they not physical harm, but the feelings maybe are hurt, and that counts in my view as harm. Or purity, like when you, I don't know, when you destroy the purity of a girl, I don't know, whatever, I think somebody could say that's a form of harm. I think maybe ultimately those ultimately lead to harm or boil down to some form of harm. I think they have to be harmful somehow. And yeah, I would see it like that. I don't know. I would have to look at the thing in detail.
Yeah, and that's what Kurt Gray tries to show. What Kurt Gray tries to show is appearances, not like to the contrary. Like, it might look like people are saying, "Oh, that's wrong because it's disgusting," or "That's wrong because it's disrespectful."
Yeah.
But what he argues is that when you put those people in a position to judge whether or not there was a victim of those actions, people say, yes, there was a victim. Somebody was harmed by the action. And this is true even from like a sort of armchair perspective. You try to give people like a harmless wrong, and they'll still say, no, somebody was harmed. That's what he tries to show, is that people will sort of automatically, even if you set up a situation in which there's no obvious victim of, like obviously no one's going to dispute if one person punches another person and takes their stuff, that person was harmed. But if you take a case like a person like committing a white lie, or like a case of incest between consenting adults, like two 25-year-old brothers or something like that. If you take cases like that, people will say that those things are wrong, and then they'll struggle sometimes to come up with an explanation. But what Gray argues is that people, if there's no obvious victim, they'll find a victim. So the family would be devastated, So they try to come up with something. And what he argues is, he's like, look, you could put people in a lab and give them these contrived scenarios where you try to rule out all the factors that ordinarily drive these judgments. But what's driving these judgments is an attempt to locate someone who has been harmed in some way. So your account sounds very much like the Gray account.
Yeah, I actually had a second argument, which I think is a bit out of our original argument, where I came up with to explain why I think it seems objective. And here's my idea. When people think about a moral dilemma, like, for example, a situation, is it morally right to steal if you're going to otherwise starve if you don't steal that thing? Now, was it really morally wrong to steal something, right? Or some moral dilemma. There are more complex moral dilemmas, obviously. I think when people analyze these cases, what people are doing, they are like reasoning for like a math problem. Instead, what they do, it feels like they are reasoning the solution to a problem based on some principles, instead of, I'm just going to give my personal opinion on that. I think when people think about it, they're okay, because they're, to repeat a little bit, they are like applying some principle. Does this violate some principle of somehow? They're reasoning. They're not, okay, I'm going to give my opinion. Is this painting beautiful or not? It's not that. I think it feels like they're reasoning an objective truth about something. So that, to me, will indicate that they see it like, Okay, there is a real criteria that determines whether an act is immoral or not, and I'm going to figure it out instead of I'm going to give my personal subjective opinion on it. Yeah, what do you think?
Oh, okay. So can you maybe go over what is it's an argument that people
Yeah.
are realists or that realism is true?
The realism is true because when people think about morality, they imagine, okay, what is the real proposition? What is the proposition? What is the truth? Because there is a truth in their view. I mean, sure, you might see it as then people think their realism is true, right? I mean, if they're not, what I'm getting at, they're not like, okay, I'm going to give my subjective opinion, right? What I'm getting is this morality objective or subjective. And when people think about it, it's not like they don't feel like they're giving their subjective opinion on something. They are thinking about some objective criteria that makes an action morally right or wrong, I think, right? That would be my argument.
Yeah. So the position you describe sounds like, so a couple things would be going on. One would be that it might empirically turn out that those people are themselves committed to realism, whether they're explicitly aware of that or not.
Yeah.
And then the question would be, okay, well, what kind of realism can we get out of this? My impression from what you've described is it would be some type of naturalist realism. So people's moral claims purport to describe facts about what's morally right or wrong. Those facts aren't made true by our preferences. They're made true by whatever objective criteria that determines whether a person has been harmed or not. And those are going to be natural facts. Those are going to be facts about like the actual factors that induce suffering in people. Those are natural facts. So you get this set of natural facts. A couple things. One is that although I do think that it's a relatively open question, whether moral cognition is reducible to judgments about harm or not. I think that the case that people are implicitly on some level moral realists is on a lot shakier ground. The evidence for that is quite weak. That's and also incidentally, my main area of research in psychology is the psychology of metaethics. So I study the question basically, are people in fact moral realists or not? And the evidence that I've seen and the data I've collected suggests no, most of them probably aren't. So I endorse a position called folk metaethical indeterminacy. I don't really think people are realists or anti-realists about this stuff. I think people make just straightforwardly normative moral judgments, and that those judgments are more or less equally consistent with realist and anti-realist perspectives. I think people's judgments are, you could say, sort of radically or hopelessly underdetermined by their actions and their judgments. And I don't think it's an epistemic question, like they really are realists or anti-realists. It's just hard to figure out which one. I think they're not really either of those. So, there would be a separate question of how good the empirical evidence is. Did I assess it correctly? So there's an empirical question there. But then there's a second issue, which is, let's say people are doing that. So they are making these judgments about what's right or wrong. They do take them to be objective claims about what causes harm or not. That kind of naturalism about moral facts looks to me like it's going to struggle to bring in some of the features that non-naturalists get pretty easily. So some naturalists may want to obtain these qualities too, but it looks like it's stripping it of or it's failing to obviously bring in any clear way the normative authority that non-natural moral facts have.
Yeah,
so you just have these descriptive facts. So there's facts. So like, let's say there's facts of the sort you described. I agree. I already agree that there's facts about what causes harm to people or not. If you operationalized human suffering or the suffering of conscious beings in some acceptable way, then I would say, yeah, there's going to be objective facts about what does or doesn't increase harm. And we can think of obvious cases. Pretty obviously, it's going to cause most human beings, biologically normal humans, it's going to harm them if you set them on fire. I don't think we need to conduct like a survey or like an experiment, like set some people on fire and then ask them afterwards, hey, did that hurt? And oh, okay, it looks like it. Like you count the decibels of how loud their screams are to determine how. No, you don't need to do that. You know that it causes suffering. So I do think there's facts of that kind. But the issue is, like, let's say that, and I care about that. So I'm moved by that on subjective grounds. I don't want people to suffer, all else being equal. But then there's the question of, let's say there's a person that's like, yeah, I don't care if people suffer. I know it's an objective fact that this action would cause this person suffering. And then they just go on to say that they're a sadist. And that's good to know, because now they're going to use that information to torture people. The question to be, is that person making any factual errors? Because if they agree with you that the action causes suffering, and they even agree that that makes it immoral, like that's what people mean when they say that like torturing people is wrong, they could say, yeah. And then also, you know what? I don't care. And then they just go ahead and do it. I wouldn't think the person is making any mistakes. I would just think they're a jerk. So
Yeah.
I don't know where you think of what you think of that sort
Yeah,
of issue.
that's a great siege into what I was going to say, and that's my position on it. My nuanced position on that is that, and almost nobody agrees with me. I never seen this. Is that this is right? There is no out component in my account of morality. I cannot give you an authority because I cannot, and I debate this with theists a lot of time. They tell me, well, there is no authority in your worldview, so you don't have an obligation to do moral to be moral. And I actually agree. Many people will disagree, but here's my reasoning is very straightforward. To say that I have an obligation to do something, it means that something bad happens to me if I don't do it. That's what the word obligation entails. Like, I have an obligation to do my homework. If I don't do it, my mom is going to punish me or something. I have an obligation to work because if I don't go, something bad is going to happen to me. But that's not the case with morality. If I am moral, right, nothing automatically happens to me. Obviously, if I break the law, it will, but and morality is closely related to the law, but not like necessarily. For example, if I make my mom feel bad, for example, that may not be illegal, but that's probably immoral. But nothing bad happens to me like automatically, so there is no authority. So I actually agree that I cannot account for a normative account of morality. I cannot do it. And I was talking about this with somebody, and they say, okay, no, but being normative is like a non-negotiable part of the definition of morality. That's what they say. And I mean, like, I'm not sure if I understand my position is unique and nuances on this, but if that's true, then I will just call my position, my thing, morality, right? It's like morality, but without the normative part. I don't know. What do you think about it?
Yeah, it's not that unique. There are people that would be content with saying, yeah, the facts that I'm capturing are descriptive facts. They don't really have normative authority. Now, they might say that they might have a different conception of normativity, so they might say that they're normative. But if we are very clear about what we're talking about, like, I would prefer some sort of term like irreducible normativity, that they have a kind of normativity that couldn't be cashed out in terms of purely descriptive facts. I'm not, some naturalists are probably going to say, yeah, I can manage that. But it sounds like you just are like, nope, I'm fine with not having that. I would imagine that there's quite a few naturalists that would just agree with you and say, yeah, I don't think we can have normative authority. What we get is this is what moral facts actually are. So, it might be something similar. It's not really the same, but something similar to compatibilism, or Dan Dennett would characterize it as the kind of free will worth wanting. So, okay, we don't have libertarian free will. So what? The compatibilist conception of free will is the better conception. Maybe there would be pragmatic justification. Maybe there would be arguably some sort of revisionary or conceptually engineering component to it. I'm skeptical of that because I'm skeptical that the libertarian conception of free will is a part of the ordinary concept, but whatever. You could do something similar here and say, look, I can't give you those features you consider non-negotiable, but I just don't think that they're non-negotiable. Let's negotiate. You could do that. So, when I approach realist positions, I tend to, it's some kind of trilemma. I've called it the tough type trilemma before, which is trivial, unintelligible, or false. And basically what I say is I'm like, look, every realist account that I've encountered so far tends to either strike me as unintelligible, like it doesn't consist of a meaningful position in the first place. It's false. And that's often reserved for certain sorts of naturalist accounts, or it's trivial. And so in your case, the position certainly strikes me as intelligible. I understand what it would mean for it to be true, but there's still the question of whether it would be trivial or false. If you're wrong about the empirical details, your position would be false. If you're right about the empirical details and the position avoids unintelligibility concerns, which it seems like it would have my biggest concern is irreducible normativity. It doesn't look like you have that component. It avoids that. So let's just say, hypothetically, you're right about the empirical stuff. Then I would raise the concern about triviality. But critically, triviality doesn't necessarily make it false. So I don't necessarily think all realist positions are false, because you could always stipulate your way to a true position. So, you could say, look, I'm stipulating that by moral facts, what I mean are facts about what causes happiness and suffering. Okay, I think there's facts of that kind. So then there's moral facts given that stipulation. What I would say about those cases is one issue is once I discover that this position is quote unquote correct, it doesn't change any operative positions I have on what the world is like. So I think the world, like I look out at the world, it's this particular way. When I learn that facts about what causes harm are what you consider to be the moral facts, what does that change? Does it change anything I predict would happen? Does it change anything I expect to occur? Does it change anything about what is deliberatively relevant to me? The answer appears to be no. And so the position seems sort of practically inert. It doesn't appear that I can do anything with its truth. And that seems like a pretty big worry to me.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah. So, you may have gotten this criticism. I get that a lot from theists who tell me that atheists cannot account for morality. And it's an argument from consequences. The consequence of anti-realism is, for example, here's the problem. Let's imagine you go out to the street and you see a guy who is just kicking a dog, right? You have no ground to tell him, hey, stop. You tell him, hey, stop. And he's going to be, why? And how could you tell me because what you're doing is wrong? You have no way to argue for that, right? In your worldview, that he's not doing anything wrong. He just don't like it. You just don't like it personally or something, right? So it's like it's only wrong in your opinion, but that's like your opinion, man. In a way. So and that's like that feels feels real bad. So how are you going? You cannot say that Holocaust is wrong. You cannot say. So somebody wants to discriminate against gays or whatever, and you cannot say that's morally wrong, right? Your position entails that, and that's like they usually bring it up as a very bad thing, right? How do you respond to this criticism when they do it?
Yeah, so I just say, two things. One, I don't need grounds to stop people from doing these things, and two, I totally can stop them. You can just stop people. You don't need justification, I don't think, for acting on your moral values. So this might be a contentious position for people that think you need justification for things. I'm often puzzled about what it is they think that I need. Justification almost seems like they're asking me if I need like for permission. Like I can't act on my values unless they'll say stuff like you can't ground your moral values. Yeah, I have preferences. I act on the preferences. If people don't like that, too bad. I don't know what else they want from me. In these cases, you just can impose your standards on other people. And what people will say is, but what makes your standards any better than anybody else's? What do you mean by better? Do you mean objectively better? I don't think anything is objectively better. And then if they go, but, like, it's like sputtering how can you impose them if they're not objectively better? I just can. Like, there's no rule prohibiting me from doing so. I have preferences. I will act on them. Like what? I don't need anyone's permission. I don't need the permission of the universe. I don't need permission from other people. I don't need permission from God. I have values. I will act on them. And, this is one thing that I'll just say, which often people kind of balk at. They don't like that sort of response. Maybe something about it strikes people as anti-intellectual. I don't think so. I think that they come into the discussion with, ironically, completely unjustified presuppositions about the conditions that need to be met for me to act on my values. My apparently I need to be justified to act on my values or to impose my values on other people. Why? What's the argument for that? I probably don't agree with it. So if this cuts both ways. If they think me imposing my values on other people needs to be justified, that position needs to be justified. Where's the argument? So then we just have to turn to that argument, and yeah. I'm going to have, I guarantee you I'm going to have objections. I'm always open to being surprised, but I'll probably have objections. And it's not like I haven't had these conversations before. So that's one thing I'll say. The other thing is I like to give people a hypothetical, which is what would you do if you found out that moral realism is not true? And if it's a theistic realist, it may require them to become an atheist. Like imagine you became an atheist and you stopped believing in objective morality. What do you do? Do you just stop caring if people are kicking puppies or if someone comes to steal your wallet, you just stop caring?
A good response. That's good response. That's a good response. Yeah.
Yeah. Some of them would say that they would care a whole lot less, and some of them might be right. They might care a lot less. That would concern me. It's one reason I'm a little reluctant to talk everybody out of their theism. If it's going to make them really nihilistic and depressed, I don't think I want that. So I think people have to be responsible dealing with people's beliefs. But For most people, I think the answer would be, yeah, I would act exactly the same as I already do. Oh, so that's funny. So those objective moral facts instilled in you by God or commanded by God, you would act exactly the same way in God's absence. So what is God's authority really doing? I mean, this is a pretty useless authority if you would do exactly the same thing anyway. The answer probably is a little bit would change, but not everything. Like, people might think blasphemy against God isn't immoral anymore if God doesn't exist. But I don't think people's general sentiments and the way that they treat other people would radically change. I don't think that they would stop wanting there to be less poverty and misery in the world. I don't think that they would just stop caring about murders. I don't think that they would just stop caring if people run a red light and drive drunk and run over a bunch of kids. I don't think they'd stop caring about most of these things. I think they would act more or less the same way they already do. What I hope with this thought experiment to illustrate is that people's subjective values are already in the driver's seat and doing most of the heavy lifting for what they do anyway.
Right. Okay. I can think of one possible objection that someone could have to the first part of what you say, when you say like, oh, I don't need justification to stop somebody from kicking a puppy. I mean, if it's like literally on the street, right, I totally understand what the point, like I can't stop the person, like I don't need to justify it if I can, right? But imagine like somebody could say that this could lead to a slippery slope kind of situation. For example, what if the government decides to act in this way? Would you like it if your government, if your politicians that rule over you, they say the same thing? Okay, we don't need any justification to enact laws anymore. We don't need a justification to do things. We are going to do based on our personal preferences. The president does that. What if the president does that? Okay, right now I'm going to enact laws based on my personal preference without any need, and we're even trying to show a justification. I mean, would you like that? You know what I mean?
Yeah, what I would say is the fact that I wouldn't like that doesn't mean that it would mean that there's got to be objective moral facts. Like, that's unfortunate, but I'm not going to think a philosophical position is true because it would be inconvenient if it wasn't true. But I also just don't. I don't really think that there's any practical implications to this. So this is everything about a government saying we don't need a justification is mediated by their beliefs, their standards, and their attitudes, not the moral facts that whether they exist or not themselves. So, this would just come down to people having different preferences than me, and I would oppose people that have different preferences than me. And if they're too powerful, sucks for me. That's too bad. That wouldn't change if there was objective morals, because they could just say, we don't care about those, and we're going to impose our standards on you. From like a Christian perspective, if a bunch of demons show up on Earth and we say, yeah, and they're like, we're going to kill all the humans now. Ha ha. You guys got your theology wrong. God's not going to save you. And then they just start wiping people out. Are Christians going to go, but wait a minute, that's objectively wrong. And then the demons are going to go, oh, it is? I didn't realize it's objectively wrong. My bad. I'll just stop killing them. No, they go, yeah, we know we're demons. And then they just keep doing it. So if a being just doesn't care if something is objectively wrong, or maybe they like it, they're intentionally doing what's wrong. All the same, but that's not justified in the world is going to be irrelevant. So it would come down to a question of whether objective moral facts exist, and then if they exist, if people care about them and are responsive to and willing to comport their behavior in accord with them. That's the only way. That's the only way moral realism being true would be practically relevant. Is it would still require the intermediary of people caring about whether it was true.
Yeah, that's right. You had an analogy about this, your conversation with Malpass. It was very interesting. I think it was very interesting. It was a very interesting analogy. You say like there is this race of alien ants that likes to colonize worlds and destroy worlds, right? And you had a good point. You're saying there is these aliens, they only like to go to other worlds and kill and unalive all these other people, right? And in a sense, how could you say they are mistaken, right? They're not mistaken about anything, right? I think you're right when you say, are they mistaken? No, they just like to do that. But here is my question. Let's say that this race of aliens, they like to go to other planets and torture those beings that are there. I mean, do you think that it is correct to say that these are evil or they are cruel? Do you think that these two words like apply to the aliens? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, there'd be a question of whether I think that that would fit with like ordinary language conventions, in which case, yes, clearly, depending on the agency of the answering question. So, uh, what it would require, I think, in the ordinary sense for them to be evil is if they have the kind of psychology where they are culpable for their actions, if they're aware of what they're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I take back, obviously, they'd be evil. The answer would be like, how smart are they? How self aware are they? How aware are they of their actions? What kind of agency do they have? I mean, if we're talking an organism that's only thought is eat, destroy, eat, kill. Like what? It doesn't have a capacity for
Yeah.
guilt or remorse. It can't reflect. Or let's say that they're just completely, their actions are entirely driven by hormones released from like, or pheromones released from the queen or something. Um, okay, then they're basically automatons. They're not conscious beings. So then they couldn't be evil. But assuming that they're aware of their actions and they have something like human psychology, yeah, I'd be fine calling them. I would say that's ordinary people would be right to call them evil. Um, sorry, I would say it would be consistent with the way ordinary people speak to call them evil. That would be like an apt way of describing them if they have certain kinds of agentic conditions, if they meet those conditions. As far as myself, I would probably do pretty much the same thing. For me, to call something evil is a sort of subjective appraisal where I would call something evil when I consider it like sufficiently intentionally malicious or harmful. That's how I use the term. So like I wouldn't typically call like a tornado evil, except in some sort of like very metaphorical sense. But I would call like a serial killer or something. I would call them evil. I wouldn't have a problem with that. But I just mean they're really, really, really bad on my view.
Yeah, I just thought of something like this moment. When you mentioned depends on their psychology in a way, and what I thought is this: okay, what if the psychology is such that unaliving other beings, it just gives them so much pleasure. It's
Right.
just so much fun that for them not to do it, asking them not to do it, it's just like asking you to sit and not watch TV, together. You know what I mean? Just for the sake of other beings who are like, for them, they are like nothing, and they can just unalive it like it's nothing, right? And at some point, if it is too much fun for them, right, to do that, then it's like, okay, they're just almost like they're justified in doing that, in a way. It just it's like, I cannot explain it. And one example, one moral example in the real world is the issue of veganism and the animal cruelty towards animals. And on one hand, for example, there are some people who think killing animals for meat is wrong, is morally wrong. I don't go that far. I don't think that's wrong, because I think that if I stop eating meat, at some point this is suffering for me, and I think that's like going too far for the animal, right? In a way, going too far in the point of I'm being way too nice. But how about, okay? What about this other issue? Uh, Things like dog fights or like bull fights, right? When people are literally like torturing the animal for fun. Now, these are getting illegal more and more in the world. And many, I would agree that that's wrong. That's morally wrong, because it's like too cruel. But what if somebody says, okay, for me, this fun of the dog fight or the bullfight is like the pleasure for you of eating the meat, right? It just gives me too much pleasure. So why? So I'm going too far if they say not to do it for the sake of the animal. And I don't see like an objective way to say, what I would have to say, speaking in normal terms, is that if I abstain myself from eating meat, I feel worse than how you feel from abstaining yourself from not having that dog fight, for example. I will have to say, so you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah,
But
I
I'm
know.
like,
I know what you're getting at.
but there is something about what I think about is, okay, how exactly do you know? It's like that's just an intuition. How do you know objectively? Okay, at this point is morally justified, but at this point is not. Like there is no objective way. There is no possible way to have an objective standard that says, okay, at this point is too much. You know what I mean? So it's like that's a problem for moral realism. I think this subjectivity thing. Yeah.
It's a problem if you heavily weight quantities of happiness and suffering. You're going to have an issue there. You're going to have a couple epistemic issues. One is going to be the commensurability in qualitatively distinct conscious states of suffering between species and for it like intra species too. So like how many instances of enjoying a slice of cake are equivalent to like breaking a leg? You know, you might think in principle that there's a way of cashing this out, like in terms of utils, like some sort of common currency, but someone may question that. Now, even if they do, even if someone thinks that there's not really this like straightforward way of making these sorts of qualitative comparisons, there can still be a sort of this would be a problem for the realist. There could still be a way of subjectively ordering it in principle. So if I had access to or all the details of all the different types of experiential states of humans and non-humans alike, I would be able to say myself, here's how much I would weigh this state against that state. But from a realist perspective, I don't even know what that would look like. That seems like a extremely difficult challenge. But I will say, if one is confident that there is a fact of the matter, I don't think that they need to get the math down to the fine-grained details to know. Like, you know, if I showed you a mountain on one side and like a heap of sand on the other, you don't need to know the exact unit of measurement to know the mountains is more.
Same argument. I use the same argument. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah. And
I
so, you know, the aliens you described that get this immense amount of pleasure out of like eating people or colonizing planets or whatever, you know, that just harkens back to like Nozick had this experience machine, this classic thought experiment, where he goes, look, and this is supposed to be an argument against a utilitarian approach, which is if you imagine this alien shows up and it gets a trillion times the pleasure out of eating each person than we would get living the course of our lives. On a utilitarian ground, like we should all line up to get eaten. Like that's what we should do. And I take it he thinks people will go, oh no, I'm not in favor of that. And that's supposed to be an intuition pump revealing, you're not really that committed to utilitarianism, are you? And so one could offer a similar sort of concern here, which is if one thinks that the pleasure someone obtains from causing harm to others, like even if it outweighed it, they might still go, that doesn't seem right. And so it could be a reason to just reject a fully consequentialist or harm focused account, at least some sort of like strict utilitarian account. So that could be a reason to reject it. One might also just ask the question of, okay, in the case of the aliens, we're stipulating that as a matter of fact about their psychology, they get X amount of orders of magnitude more pleasure out of harming us than we get out of living our lives. But in the case of humans, I think a plausible case could be made that it's very implausible that anybody would get so much happiness or avoid so much suffering from consuming animal products that it could justify factory farming or something like that. That doesn't strike me as very likely.
Okay.
I don't want to get too much into the normative ethics, but then it would just be a question of like, is it plausible that a person gets so much more happiness from eating animals than the amount of suffering caused to them? I would bet strongly against that.
Yeah, maybe. So, you know, what I also, another interesting aspect of this kind of things is like moral dilemmas, and a typical one is like the trolley problem. And I think it's very funny because when you think about it, I don't even have a good way to approach this. For example, so there is the classic example, there is a person, there is a trolley, is going to run over 5 persons, but you can change it so it runs over 1 person, right? Then you save the 5 persons. That seems kind of right to me in a way, for my subjective or my intuition about it. But now pushing a fat guy into the rail, I'm not sure that start getting like, I don't still feel, it begins to feel wrong at that point. But if somebody were to say, okay, it's okay to push the fat guy into the rails, then by that logic, if a homeless man walks into a hospital and you can unalive him to get his organs, to give his organs to 5 people, then that's morally okay. And at that point, that I just think is obviously morally wrong, right? I'm not sure how to explain it, how to prove it, but my intuition is like that's obviously morally wrong, right? So I don't know how, what do you think these kind of things tell us about moral realism or anti-realism? You know, what do you think is
I don't think they tell us a whole lot about the realism anti-realism dispute, because I think that they're largely confined to normative moral considerations. In the case of the organ transplant scenario that you describe, I think that there's a pretty good utilitarian rationale, even if you are concerned about harm, of saying, yeah, it wouldn't be okay to harvest the organs of a person that comes into a hospital. And the reason for that is pretty obvious. In the real world, if hospitals were licensed to do that, then people wouldn't go to hospitals. They'd be very afraid of it.
I think maybe that misses the point a little bit. Let's imagine, for the sake of the argument, nobody's going to know what the hospital did to the homeless man. Let's, for the sake of the argument, imagine that. Just the situation, is it immoral or not, independent of whether people are going to find out.
I understand. Yeah, you can constrain it and say no one's going to know. There's no consequences. You're sure you're going to get away with it. You're sure the transplants are all going to work. Blah blah blah. Yeah. In those cases, I think it's telling people something about their own psychology. I think it's telling them, I'm not really okay with actively bringing about, severe harm or unaliving innocent people in order to bring about a quote unquote greater good. And so it might reveal to some people that they have a psychological disposition, or at least some tension with whatever utilitarian disposition that they have. So it might reveal people have some sort of deontological normative concerns, whether they want to endorse them on reflection or not.
Yeah. So we were talking earlier about the argument from convergence. This is a popular argument for moral realism. I have heard people make it, and that's like, humanity is discovering moral truths, and that's why as we get more, we approach more modernity, people start like converging on morals. Personally, I don't find this super strong, and my response to that, my immediate response to that, would be, how do you know, for example, that it was not the fact that the USA had cultural influence all over the world, and because the people in other parts in the world are watching American TV, American movies, or Western movies, they're absorbing the morals from that in a large part, and that accounts for why people in Asia appear to be converging towards a Western morality, right? I think that's a better explanation for convergence, actually, or at least a perfectly valid explanation. I mean, that would be my counter argument to the convergence argument. How would you respond to this convergence argument?
I would give roughly the same sort of argument. So, quite convenient. All this convergence has happened in the past 5 or 6 centuries. Something also happened in the past 5 or 6 centuries, which was colonialism. So you had one part of the world, and a relatively small part of the world, colonized most of the rest of the world. They brought Christianity, they brought missionaries, they brought changes in culture, administration, forms of government. They forcibly democratized places. They brought an enormous amount of cultural osmosis in terms of the media people consume. I mean, take a look at the world. All over the world, you're going to find McDonald's, you're going to find Coca-Cola, you're going to find blue jeans. Is this good evidence, because we have convergence in fashion and food, of fashion realism, of best soda flavor realism? Like, it's ridiculous. No, the explanation is that when certain sorts of cultures have a lot more power and influence than others, they tend there tends to be asymmetries in the type of cultural diffusion that you observe. And when that asymmetric diffusion occurs over the course of century after century after century, then people become more similar to one another. Prior to that, people were more isolated. So it should come as no surprise that following ships and planes and trains, that the more people interact, that the dominant forces tend to gobble up and consume the less dominant forces, and tend to impose and standard. Like right now, there's 6,000 or 7,000 languages in the world. It's hard to count them all. Languages are dying off all over the world, and certain sorts of languages are increasingly the lingua franca of the world, including, unsurprisingly, English. Is it a coincidence that English is the lingua franca of the world? Well, of those empires that colonized the world, which was the most successful and largest one? Might it be, the English? What a coincidence. So, is the convergence in speaking English, is that evidence of linguistic normative realism, that English is the correct language to speak? No, that's ridiculous. It's absurd. You have some counterfactual, someone in some other, that speaks Malay, or that speaks, an indigenous North American language. their culture had invented guns 300 years earlier. They had horrible diseases that they got a resistance to. You wind back the clock and you change up the historical contingencies, and the whole cultural landscape of the world could look radically different than it does today. And not only would I expect a lot of the fashion trends and food preferences to differ, I would also expect the moral standards to differ. But there's another thing underneath all of this, because you proposed a sort of cultural historical explanation, and so am I. But the other thing is, when humans are exposed to other humans, there may be natural tendencies for them to converge on certain sorts of patterns of behavior due to shared features of our psychology. So, it's the convergence in food preferences around the world is not random or arbitrary. So it's not like some disgusting food could have, like some food people generally find disgusting, under some counterfactual could have easily become the most popular food in the world. People like things that are fatty, oily, greasy. Potato chips were going to be a thing. That was pretty much inevitable. I mean, Thanos is inevitable. French fries are inevitable. So, but that has something to do with our shared psychology. And that doesn't tell us that we're responsive to these like facts independent of our preferences or values. It tells us that when we're presented with the opportunity to act on similar values to other people, we will act on similar values to other people. And the same could be true of moral values, which you could see as a sort of contingent coordinating psychology. A contingent coordinating strategy. So under conditions of strong socio-cultural and linguistic isolation, the best strategy when you encounter strangers might be, in most circumstances, be extremely cautious, maybe kill them all, right? So from a survival perspective, that might be the most effective strategy. In the modern world, if you're a small community, the most effective strategy isn't fight everybody to the death, because that's not going to play out very well. It's integrate, get along, don't assimilate, don't get annihilated. And so humans aren't stupid. The strategies that they employ are going to be responsive to the social conditions in which they're in. In an ancient world, 15,000 years ago, prior to agriculture, people are in these small bands. There's not this clearly dominant force with massively superior technology. When there was, populations got wiped out. Neanderthals got wiped out. Maybe Homo sapiens displaced them through violence. I don't think it's known exactly what happened. Obviously, there's some interbreeding. But the point is that the proper moral standards to favor which ones people land on could be a product of which sorts of moral standards are going to be useful in the relevant context. And so it's not going to be entirely culturally and historically contingent. It's also going to be like a practical question about what sort of strategies of normative systems are going to be beneficial. I think I said too much about that,
yeah,
but basically,
point.
I think we have a lot of better explanations than people are picking up on the objective moral facts.
Yeah, I think that last point was very good. Like maybe they were more useful. That's why they became.
Let me give an example. People around the world are all going to end up fashioning boats the same way, because there's going to be facts about physics and displacement of water. And so it doesn't require specifically historical contingent facts, like everybody had to learn how to build boats from everybody else. The same thing with morals as a technology. You don't have to learn from somebody. Randomly stabbing people in your own community is probably not a good way to get along. It doesn't require like, oh, really? We had no idea. This is something people could discover, because in two different communities, it's equally not good for cooperation for people to randomly stab one another. So like the fact that humans have shared goals, values, and preferences is an obvious reason why they might end up converging on similar moral standards under similar environmental conditions. So this is tied to the historical cultural perspective, which is that as cultural, technological, and institutional conditions become more similar, morality comes along for the ride as a natural byproduct of that, or as literally part of it.
Yeah. So I also had this argument for, I tried to make an argument for why justice has to be subjective. I think I have an argument for that. And maybe after that, we can talk a little bit about Euthyphro dilemma, and then we can just wrap it up, right?
Okay.
So this is my argument for why it seems like justice has to be subjective. So imagine a person committed a crime. For example, he stole $1, right? Now, a judge has to think, what is the appropriate punishment for stealing $1? What is the first thing? What is one rule? The punishment needs to be like somehow greater than the harm that they cause. It cannot be, okay, paying $1. It cannot be that. It has to be more. It has to be, for example, let's sit in jail for, a day or two or whatever. But here's what I think. There is no way to calculate how much. Let's say let's say we could reduce it to units of harm. Like by stealing $1, he did 1 unit of harm to somebody else. Okay, so he needs to receive more units of harm. Here's my question. Okay, how many? 2, 3, 1,5, 5. And the point I'm trying to make is, no matter what, it just seems like it's not possible. Any number there is other than 1 is going to feel arbitrary. 1, we agree 1 is wrong because it has to be more than 1, right? More than the harm that he did. But any number is going to seem like arbitrary, like there's no reason why 2 instead of 4, any possible number. So what it means to be is like this attempts to prove that a judge applying justice always going to be his subjective opinion. That's what that's the argument I came up with. It has to be subjective because no objective criteria will lead you to this number. So how do you think about this? What do you think about this argument? How do you think a moral realist will respond to this, for example?
Yeah. So how the realist would respond to it is going to
what do
turn.
you think?
Yeah, it's going to turn in part on the normative ethical system that they endorse. So if they're a utilitarian, they're going to have an answer. So the answer is going to be that the utilitarian takes a different approach to the purpose or like why we punish people than a non-utilitarian. So for a utilitarian, the purpose of punishment is to maximize utility.
Right.
And so the punishment you dole out, there's going to be some fact of the matter about what kind of punishment optimizes for overall utility. And then what they are dealing with is not a sort of conceptual or metaphysical question, like there's no fact of the matter in principle, like there's no quantity on my account. It's more that there's going to be some fact of the matter. It's just super hard in practice to figure it out. And utilitarians aren't obligated to think that they need to have perfect accuracy or know exactly how to measure things in order to, going back to that mountain versus the heap analogy. Utilitarians could just say, look, we do our best. We are operating under epistemic constraints. And so I think it's very important to recognize that utilitarianism provides the criterion of good. It doesn't provide like the decision theoretic optimums. So it just says, look, this is the goal. It's a separate question what methods we use to get to that goal. And so utilitarians are just going to operate within the best of what's epistemically available to them to figure out what strategy or what approach to punishment is most conducive to maximizing utility. As for others, yeah, I don't know how they're going to solve that problem. Deontologists presumably are going to provide some sort of principled rationale for how and why you punish people in particular sorts of ways. But some of them might just grant something like this. Look, we don't have, from a realist perspective, or let's say you're a realist deontologist, they might think that there's objective facts about what actions are wrong, what actions deserve punishment, but then think that the granularity of the precise way in which you punish someone kind of just falls outside the scope, maybe not even just on epistemic grounds, but just on any sort of conceivably defensible grounds in principle. So a person commits a very serious crime. Is a realist committed to there being a fact of the matter that person they should face exactly 17 years, 6 months, 3 days, and 6 hours of prison, and it's the exact prison conditions? So, if there's one extra rat in that prison, making it a little less unpleasant, that it just seems like that would be too demanding of a position. Because then. Again, maybe they would just think it's an epistemic issue. Yeah, sure, there's some fact of the matter about that, but that sort of granularity is outside the scope of what we can achieve with the available methods. So they might think that, or they might just think, look, there's going to be a range of acceptable methods of punishment, and what we think the objective fact is that it falls within that range. And within that range, there's going to be reasonable people could dispute, one or the other side. And I say that because that's, look, I don't do a lot of standard normative analytic ethics, but that sounds reasonable to me. That doesn't seem like a huge problem to me. I don't see a huge problem with the deontologist saying, look, if a person commits a serious crime, like 10 to 15 years of prison time. I'm not sure exactly how much. What should the prison be like? Well, they shouldn't torture the person, but it also shouldn't be a paradise. Where does it fall in between? Basically, I think deontologists should be allowed the grace of having like error bars on their judgments on these things. But it would be a problem, I think, if someone said, nope, there's an objective fact of the matter, and I don't know what it is. Because if you're going to be that much of a stickler, what that would mean is pretty much every punishment anybody's ever been given has probably been unjust.
Yeah.
Which sounds kind of insane.
Yeah.
That might be a reductio of someone thinking that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, just think about it. Okay, let's say that a person decides, okay, the proper punishment for this is to get like punched in the face or whipped, right? So, but whipped, but with exactly how much pain, like how much exactly. So, you know, how fine grained, how like small do the units of suffering get? Like, so is it like exactly 1.683322211443 units of suffering? That's the exact right amount. And then let's say we figure that out, right? Let's say we have a machine and it says the proper amount of punishment with the whip is this unit. How do you deliver that? Like, it's going to be contingent on the whip, the person using the whip, the conditions in which they wield the whip.
Now you're fine. You just froze a little bit, but now it's fine. Okay.
Oh, okay. You're frozen on my end. Now you're
no
back.
Way.
Now you're back. So you're going to have this problem of, even if you could figure out these facts, it would be virtually impossible to implement them in any practical way. Like, you're not going to be able to get the whip to do exactly what you want. So I don't know which parts of that you might have missed, but
no, I know. Yeah. I got most of it. Yeah.
Cool.
Oh yeah, sure. No, I mean, just to respond to that real quick, I think the first person who says the punishment is for the good of society, they may have an answer to my dilemma. But the person who says, no, he's going to get a punishment that he deserves, what I'm trying to get is that there is no method of calculating that is not subjective. Like, it's not, and there is two different claims. It's not that it is difficult in practice to calculate the exact number. It's not that. It's that any method of calculating, even a range, I could grant you that. I could be, okay, give me a range. No, you don't have to give me an exact number, give me a range. Even that, any method is going to, any number is going to feel arbitrary. Maybe I'm wrong when I think of numbers. Maybe when I think in terms of numbers, I don't know.
I don't think so. So if a person's a realist and they're comfortable having intuitions about what's morally right or wrong, I think they'd also be comfortable having intuitions about what kind of punishment is appropriate. It would just be like at a pretty, like, it would have low granularity or low resolution. So they would say, look, 10 to 15 years. So if they can have an intuition that the person should go to prison, I don't see why they couldn't have an intuition that it should be 10 or 15. But the only thing I think they would struggle to do is to give exactly the same amount as another person. And I think they could weather that storm. So you have two deontologists. They both agree that there's objective moral facts. They both think a person that does this particular crime should get prison time. And then one of them says 7 years and one of them says 10 years. Does that have to be explicable in terms of their subjective attitudes? No, I think that personally, I think that's what's actually going on. But what they could say is, no, we just have intuitions and they're not that precise.
Yeah, okay, that's a good. Yeah, I think that would be a fair response. Yeah, sure, okay, that's good.
Yeah. Now, if you have I think you could wield a response to that, which is, okay, but if we actually look at it in practice, the range is so wide that raises a lot of concerns. Because some people are going to say, you know, they shouldn't get prison at all, or some people favor the death penalty. So people's like criminal justice sorts of attitudes, if those turn out to be super duper variable, even when they agree on what the moral facts are, that I think that's cause for concern for them.
Okay. Right. So maybe the last topic. So since this is an atheist channel, like, I don't know where you stand in the whole theism, but there is something called the Euthyphro dilemma, right? Mm-hmm. You know, the atheists say that the theist, you don't really have an objective morality either, because either God has some reasons for giving like some moral commands, or he doesn't. And if he does have the reason, then we can appeal to the reasons, and this is actually the reasons that is those reasons that ground morality. And if he doesn't, then it's arbitrary as well. It was just his preference. And the move that they will try to make is just to say, no, something is good, not because God commands it, something is good because it aligns with God's nature, right? It's part of his own nature. That's just what they say. And what I say then is that this doesn't solve the problem. This merely pushes the problem one level further, because then you can ask, but why some virtue like fairness, kindness, why were those part of God's nature? And your answer better not be, oh, because they are good, right? Because you cannot say that, right? There is ultimately those things were arbitrary as well. If there is no reason why those were part of their nature, then they are arbitrary. And here's what they try, the response that I get. So far you get right what the issue is.
Mm-hmm.
So the response, one move that they maybe could make is to say that those God's nature was necessary. And so I want to say, like, if God had been hateful, then hateful would have been part of his nature, and then hate will be good. And they're going to say, no, his nature couldn't have been different because it was necessary. They try to make that move. So it's not like it couldn't have been different also, right? So it's saying that I'm positing something nonsensical. And I think that's missing the point a little bit, but I don't know how to word it exactly, how to respond there at that point. So what do you think of the whole thing?
Yeah, I think you're right about that. So they might have moves they could make that get them out of the Euthyphro dilemma. I'm not so I mean, one thing that William Lane Craig pointed out about the Euthyphro dilemma that I think is technically correct is that the two options don't appear to be obviously mutually exhaustive. So it's not like A or not A. So is it good because God says, or does God say it because it's good? There's a kind of reversal of one another, but it doesn't seem logically impossible that the answer could be neither. So that's one thing to note about the Euthyphro dilemma, is that as classically framed, it doesn't strike me as straightforwardly looking like it's mutually exhaustive and therefore presenting like strictly speaking, a true dichotomy. Of course, those could be the only viable or defensible answers. So, part of what will happen when theists say the answer is neither, it's because God is the good, or it's that moral facts flow from God's nature or something like that. If you then say, if you then raise the particular challenge you do, so maybe they could defend that in some other particular way. But when you make the move you make, and then they say, no, God couldn't have favored cruelty or whatever because God's good features are necessary, I think that is missing the point. And I've had this argument with realists before, because they'll say something like, the moral facts couldn't have been otherwise because the moral facts are necessary. But then they're just helping themselves to the presupposition that what they take the moral facts to be are the moral facts that are necessary, which is not something that you have to grant from the outset. Unless they think that they were like logically necessary, in which case they should be able to like furnish you with the contradiction between like God being good and then God favoring something really bad. I don't think they're going to be able to do that, because they're already helping themselves to the assumption that you agree with them on first order normative grounds that cruelty is morally bad and compassion is morally good. But let's say you disagree. Now they're going to have a problem here. And so you could just agree, look, whatever God's nature turned out to be, like whatever the content of the moral values he favors that flows from his nature, sure, whatever that is sort of maybe metaphysically necessary. It's necessary. Okay, but it's an open question what that content has to be. It could have been like whatever it is. Like you could, is it impossible for them to entertain the counterfactual, in which God's moral, like what God commands of us is it does follow from his nature. His nature is necessary, but it turns out that what he commands us to do is like torture and eat babies or whatever. Well, I don't see why would that be impossible. So I think some clarification about the type of necessity they're talking about, why they think that you couldn't be conditionally some other set of values or preferences could have been, or some other sort of nature could have been necessary. That's one thing that I would say. So I think you're right about that. The other thing is when they start saying that God is the good, or that good flows from his nature, it starts to become increasingly unclear what they mean by good at that point. So they start abstracting away from all the ways in which you would normally evaluate like whether a person is good. So, I would judge whether a person is good based on concrete features of their conduct. So like take up parents. Good parents wouldn't just like leave their children to suffer and not survive. Good parents would take their children to the doctor. Good parents would do X, Y, Z. And then you make the analogy to God. What does God do when a child gets leukemia? God doesn't do anything. God just lets them suffer for it. And so when you start analogizing all the ways in which we would ordinarily make judgments about human behavior as good or bad, they don't apply to God somehow. So like if you judge by God by those standards, it looks to me like God would be this horrific monster. Now, the problem is theists have moves here. Theists could say that that's compensated in some way. They could say that there's a reason why God would act differently from us. That's conditional on on a bunch of relevant differences between God and us that we just don't know the answer, which could be true. They could be right about that. So they have moves they can make to defend against that. And so they might have moves in this case to defend against the charge that the position, like they just pushed it back and they don't have a response. But the necessary move you describe, I don't think that one's doing the work.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's cool. That's great. So I think we can wrap it up. I don't know if there is maybe any final thoughts you want to share or anything you want to say, like to conclude, or we can just.
No, not really. I guess I'll just know I don't normally talk a lot about normative ethics, and so it's kind of interesting to talk about it. I feel like I was able to talk about it, but man, that was pulling some stuff out of the attic that, it's a very strange thing. I'll say this. I used to do normative ethics and applied ethics and meta ethics. I just did all moral philosophy, not like professionally when I was a student, but I don't know exactly what happened with my psychology and my interests. Maybe it had something to do with doing a dissertation and the narrowing process of focusing so much on a single topic. But when I emerged out on the other side, I kind of lost interest in normative ethics and applied ethics. I don't really think about them very much anymore. I don't do them like I can do them, but you might notice that I kind of keep all those issues at arm's length. I'm not taking positions on what I think is the correct normative moral position on any of these matters. I could discuss them, but I feel very detached from them now. And talking about it, I'm noticing how strange that feels. Something strange. I don't know what happened to me.
Okay.
So I don't know. Maybe I got to reflect on this, and I should be concerned.
Yeah.
I guess that's it. The other thing is just this has been great. We were talking about this before we went on here, but I had a wild day of like illness right up until I got here. I had 1 hour to get ready, but wow, it's been rough. But I'm glad I feel like my brain is working. So
yeah, it's great. Thank you very much. I think it was a great talk as well. I had a lot of fun. Yeah, it was very interesting.
Well, you got to pop by my channel sometime so we can talk again.
Yeah, great. And guys, by the way, I'm gonna leave a link in the description for his channel. So please make sure to go and subscribe. So anyway, thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe to the channel, and see you next time. Bye.